Hi, everybody. I'm Ramya Kannan, the health editor with The Hindu. And today we have with us a very special man, one of my own ilk, I would like to say. We have investigative journalist Gardiner Harris, whose recently published book, The Dark Secrets of Johnson and Johnson, has blown the lid of what seems to be a massive cover-up operation. As you might have figured out by now, the book is a hard-hitting expose on what went on at Johnson and Johnson, and it uncovers the secrets of what actually went into its wildly popular product. So, Gardner was a former pharma reporter with the New York Times, and he grew up as a Johnson boy, and we'll come to that in a bit. But here he picks holes in every aspect of the company's vast repertoire, accusing it of knowingly and willfully concealing information about its products across the range consumer, drugs, and medical devices. And these went on to adversely affect the health of their consumers. And clearly, there was a profit motive at hand. So, Gardner, if we may, we start with what you thought was the most egregious violation of Johnson and Johnson.
Well, Ramya, I'm glad to be here. As you might know, I was also the South Asia correspondent for the New York Times for some time, lived in Delhi, and the Hindu was always my first read in the mornings, amongst the 7 or 8 papers that I used to get. So I'm delighted to be here. As you have ably summarized, the book goes through a whole series of different products. Baby powder, how it was for decades contaminated with asbestos. It talks about the difficulties of Tylenol, how it is by far and away the most dangerous over-the-counter medicine. Some of the prescription medicines that I go through are like Risperdal. It's an antipsychotic that Johnson & Johnson ran a criminal program to sell, particularly to the elderly, even though it knew that it would kill the elderly in great numbers. EPO is another drug, a cancer drug, that it kept secret the fact that this drug actually encouraged the growth of tumors instead of discouraging it. And then a series of devices like metal-on-metal hip implants that it knew would disintegrate into poisonous metal ions. Vaginal mesh, similarly, how it knew that hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of women would never be able to have vaginal sex again. And then, of course, its own COVID vaccine. So a whole series of products where the pattern was absolutely clear. Johnson & Johnson early on would find out that its product was dangerous, would hide those dangers, not only from the public, but from the FDA and other regulatory agencies around the world, and would know that the result is a huge amount of death. I estimate at least 2 million Americans alone died, never mind Indians and others across the world. Because, of course, Johnson & Johnson is the largest healthcare products conglomerate in the world. And in fact, if you've had surgery, there's a very good chance, 80% chance, that you've been sutured up with Johnson & Johnson's sutures and any number of other products used in hospitals. As for what is the worst product, the numbers speak for themselves. I didn't even mention that Johnson & Johnson probably caused the United States' opioid crisis even more than Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers that have been blamed for much of it. But epidemiological analysis show that Risperdal is probably one of the most deadly drugs that has ever been sold in the United States. There's an analysis that shows that Johnson & Johnson's knowingly criminal scheme in marketing it has cost at least 1 million lives in the United States, and probably far more. So, and then there is the whole issue of how it sold Risperdal to kids. And it sold Risperdal to children, even though this is a drug unique in its class that causes boys to grow breasts and young girls to express milk. And again, Johnson & Johnson hid those risks, lied about them in publications. And the result was at least 60,000 boys grew breasts who would not otherwise have done that. And of course, once a boy has something called gynecomastia, grows breasts, that tissue is permanently part of them unless it is removed in a double mastectomy, which, as you know, Ramya, is a very difficult and invasive procedure. So, if you, I think it is hard to pick selling a powder for babies and mothers that you know is contaminated with asbestos that is poisonous, that has led tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of women around the world to get ovarian cancer. That's pretty bad. They also sold a heartburn medicine that they knew wasn't helpful for children, and in some cases killed them. That's really bad. They attacked women's reproductive organs again and again and again with a variety of products. So it really is hard to kind of rank order the worst of the worst. But just in terms of sheer numbers, it would probably be Risperdal.
Right. So you've lived in India, and you know how pervasive Johnson and Johnson is here. In fact, I was reading this book the other day, and one of my colleagues, she's like, Johnson and Johnson. You mean the baby powder guys? I was like,
Right.
yeah, the baby powder guys. Um, I myself, stayed off the baby powder because when my, girl was born, but then, and then there was shampoo, and people are constantly giving you Johnson and Johnson kits. It's really difficult to be a new mom and escape the Johnson and Johnson baby kit in India as of
Yep.
now.
It's
So
true around the world.
yeah, so this book rings very true to us. But you have written in your book about how you grew up in a Johnson and Johnson town, and Johnson and Johnson was this benevolent employer, and it to grow up with something and to have that whole world come crashing down your ears. Did that take a lot of effort to process it and then come on to write a book on this? I'm just wondering how you handled that.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, as I mentioned in the book, I spent part of my growing up years in Princeton, New Jersey, and Princeton is right next to New Brunswick, where Johnson and Johnson is headquartered, and many of the top executives end up living in Princeton. It's a very nice town. They sent their kids to the private schools around Princeton, like Princeton Day School and Lawrenceville. I went to the public high school nearby, but I knew a lot of the kids of executives. And the Johnson family had a big mansion in town, and they had this famous Christmas party that was incredibly opulent, and was the talk of the town often during the Christmas season. And there was a sense growing up, and this is really the reason I did this book, that Johnson and Johnson was really the kind of capitalistic ideal, that this was a company that both did well financially and did good in society, that it was seen as sort of mom apple pie and America all rolled into one, that they discovered great products, brought them to the marketplace, and saved lives and made lives better. So it was when I first got the pharmaceutical beat, when I worked for the Wall Street Journal, I, of course, expected that to have a wonderful time covering Johnson and Johnson. I expected that they would be very open with me and talk about their operation in an honest and forthright way. And My interactions with them were just the opposite. And it surprised me. They were the least open with reporters. They were the most secretive. You remember, Ramya, when the AIDS in Africa crisis hit at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. And in fact, India, as you know, played an enormous role in saving millions of lives in Africa because your great generic companies, and Cipla being one, and Yusuf Hamid was a friend of mine, both before I came to India and while I was in India. And of course, Indian generic companies were able to make cheap generics of these anti-AIDS drugs because the scandal around the pricing of them led many of these companies, most of them in the United States, to agree to allow generics companies to sell these drugs in Africa and to sort of surrender essentially their sales rights in Africa. Johnson & Johnson was the only major manufacturer of AIDS drugs that refused to allow that. It was the only major manufacturer that would not surrender its patents to the UN AIDS program. And as I was writing the stories about the AIDS crisis, I kind of couldn't believe it. I mean, this is Johnson & Johnson, thought to be one of the most ethical companies in the world. And it is the lone holdout in saving tens of millions of lives in Africa. I mean, I thought there must be some mistake. But in story after story after story, the image of this company ended up being entirely the opposite of the reality. And it probably hit me hardest when my own first son was born. He was born early. He ended up spending 4 or 5 days in the NICU unit. Anyone who's a parent knows that this is one of the most upsetting and difficult times of your life. Your child is born and has health problems, and you remain in the hospital with that child with your heart in your throat. My son Aiden eventually did come home and was healthy, but soon after that, and this is back in the day when none of us got parental leave. If you're a father, you went straight back to work. And I went straight back to work, and soon after got a whole bunch of documents showing that Johnson & Johnson had sold this heartburn drug called Propulsid. And even though the company had done 20 clinical trials in children and infants, each one of which had failed to show that there was a benefit, the company nonetheless underwrote a secret and illegal marketing program to sell them to infants, a program that was so successful that 1 in 5 infants in NICU units across the United States were given Propulsid. And so not only did this drug not help these children, but it caused what's called a QT prolongation, which is a heart arrhythmia. And for newborns, and particularly for preemies, a heart arrhythmia can be fatal and cause all kinds of damage. And so sure enough, there were dead babies that kept happening, and this sort of pile of dead babies. And Johnson & Johnson nonetheless kept up with this marketing program. And having had a child in a NICU unit myself just weeks before, I couldn't believe that this company had deliberately targeted children in NICU units for sales of a product that it knew not only didn't help these children, but in rare cases killed them. So that was really, the AIDS thing. What the reason I thought it was so important to do this book is that while I would find out terrible things about single products, and I think this is the reaction that many people have had over the last couple of years around baby powder. There's this sense of, well, this is Johnson & Johnson. They couldn't have done anything wrong here. And then if you persuade them that really the actions here are problematic, they will say, well, okay, so they did it with this one product, but it's a really good company. And to kind of overcome that, I felt that it was important to do an entire book about a whole series of products. My original draft of this book was nearly twice as long, and I had 4 or 5 more products that I talked about. I could have done dozens. This is a company that it consistently behaves badly, consistently hides risks, consistently lies about them to not only the public and doctors, but to regulatory authorities. And the remarkable thing about Johnson & Johnson is that it has avoided accountability for this bad behavior for decades and decades and decades. And I point out, I end up getting these secret grand jury files and point out why prosecutors really never held any of these executives to account for all of these terrible actions.
Right. So thank you first for writing this book. Like I said, it's of great value, particularly in India, as you know, you've spent time here. Um, when a journalist tries to do some investigative work, then a lot of people accuse us of muckraking. You know, but that is the way we work. That is the way we employ to bring truth out into the open. In this case, clearly there's been a lot of muck that you'd had to sift through.
Yeah.
But uh, how did you handle Johnson and Johnson and its might as you went by your business?
Well, so I did cover the company for many, many years. I knew a lot of the executives, and I certainly knew how to reach out to the company. And as soon as I got the contract for this book, I did that very thing and told them that I'm writing this book. I would love for them to participate in it. I would, I want to go over with them in detail everything I find and get their reactions. But Johnson & Johnson, again, its reaction to that was the same reaction it had had throughout my career, which is to stonewall, not talk to me, not participate, and hope the story goes away. Now, I'll tell you, Ramya, it is one of the most powerful companies in the world. And I tell story after story in the book about how Johnson & Johnson managed to kill or sideline any number of journalists who tried to tell many of these stories before me. And that's because it's one of the largest advertisers in the world. And we are muckrakers, but we work for media organizations that depend on advertising. And so in case after case after case, the company's executives called up the headquarters of the various media organizations looking into this behavior and said that if you went ahead with the story, we will pull all of our advertising. And in case after case after case, those stories never ran as a result of that. Now, not only do they have this extraordinary power over media, but then they also have incredible influence in the medical systems of each of our countries as well. There is not a medical school in the United States that does not get significant funding from Johnson & Johnson. Many of the top experts in any given field are consultants for the company. I can't tell you the number of times that I called up sources of mine who I had worked with for many, many years, told them that I was working on a tough story on Johnson & Johnson. And they said, Gardiner, I can't help you. Do you know what kind of lawyers these people have? And that is, of course, the last and perhaps most important way that Johnson & Johnson has avoided accountability and publicity for its actions. And this is a company that has spent $35 billion on litigation expenses since 2000. 2013. It has spent roughly 10% of what the entire Fortune 500 group of companies has spent on lawyers. Johnson & Johnson alone has spent that. So almost every major corporate law firm in the United States, certainly, and I'm sure that this is true in India as well, has Johnson & Johnson as one of its most important clients. And the company has a history of being extremely aggressive in going after critics. Experts in litigation that testify against it have found themselves the target of lawsuits from the company. There's a remarkable story during the baby powder litigation where the lawyers were in New Brunswick. They were staying in the Heinrich Hotel, which is one of the largest hotels and nicest hotels in New Brunswick. And they came back from a long day at court to the hotel to find that their room keys no longer functioned. And they went down to the front desk, talked to the assistant manager and said, "What? Our room keys don't work." And the assistant manager said, "Oh yeah, Johnson & Johnson called us up and told us to kick you out." So it's just a company that simply doesn't relent. And we saw this also in the baby powder litigation. It tried to file for bankruptcy using this remarkable process called the Texas two-step, in which hives off just, makes a company, puts its liability in that company, and then declares that company to be bankrupt while keeping all of the profitable products back in the mothership. So again, Johnson & Johnson has used a whole series of ways to hide and to make sure that it is not brought to account.
Right. Yeah, that's, I sort of get a sense of how that might operate because, we know of the might and the heft that pharma companies wield in nations across the world.
Sure.
So, in terms of, all this, I mean, having listened to you talk about how you went about the project, can I ask you if at some time you felt a bit like Erin Brockovich?
I never looked that good, of course. Julia Roberts
Yeah, it's tough
is
competing with Julia Roberts, but
oh boy, yeah. Um, I think, Ramya, what was difficult about this process is just how dark it is and how depressing the work often was. The book, again, as I said, was twice as long, and I quoted in the original version a lot more of the company's victims, families who lost loved ones. And kids who were forever scarred. And it's really hard to write about that, to talk to these people on a day in and day out basis. I spent more than 5 years writing this book. And I'm religious. I go to church. I'm a Christian. I go to church quite regularly. And I found that I really needed that outlet throughout this process, even more than normal, because I found I needed to appeal to God to sort of help me through this, because it is, the company's behavior is so dark, and you can sort of lose hope about almost the human condition, because they have caused so many deaths and have had no one hold them to account. One of the stories that I tell in the book is the company did plead guilty to criminal charges in its marketing of Risperdal. I end up getting a lot of the records around that investigation and that prosecution. And I point out that 3 of the 4 prosecutors in charge of that case ended up going to work for law firms where Johnson & Johnson is a significant client. And I use that to explain why the prosecutors didn't try to charge executives, because if you are a prosecutor and you want a career in private practice, it's almost certainly the case that you are going to limit your job prospects if you go after this company that is the most important player in corporate defense work in the world. So it just, Ramya, felt kind of hopeless for a lot of this time. And as you point out, I really only focused on the company's actions in the United States. I knew about some of these actions in India. I also knew about some of these actions in Australia. I make short references to some of this around the world, but the story is it's just too big for one person or even a team of people to tackle, to do every piece of this story all over the world, and to try to even count the dead bodies. It's just so vast. And that became a great burden for a long time for me. It's just a very dark tale. And I am thrilled and surprised, actually, that it's gotten as many readers as it has, because, and I've heard from a lot of readers that they had to put the book down for a little while just to kind of recover and then come back to it. My hope is that in reading it, people can understand how the health system can injure them, and it can provide them with the tools to protect themselves and their families, because they can see how, hopefully, to avoid the worst of the worst.
Right. So the other thing that you have really stressed on is the role of the FDA in in regulation and their and coordination and the systemic issues that have constantly dogged the functioning of the FDA. Given that America is going through a churn now, as we see it, particularly in the healthcare sector, some well-held beliefs are being turned on their head. Um, how do you now, at this point of time, think that the regulatory agency could have done better in this case?
Well, the portrait I paint of the FDA is one of real feckless disregard for protecting the public. Unfortunately, the FDA is largely funded by drug makers, by what are known as user fees from the drug industry. And the result of that is that the FDA has become captive to the very industry that it regulates. And top FDA officials frequently talk about their customers being the drug industry and not really the public. And that a lot of people have been concerned about that, but I think you really see the consequences when you look across a whole series of products from one company, and of course, in this case, the most important products company. And so when I talk about baby powder, for instance, people had petitioned the FDA repeatedly that the FDA require there be a cancer warning on all products with talcum powder. Would have included Johnson's baby powder. And the FDA sort of refused to answer those petitions until finally Johnson & Johnson lost its first baby powder case. And then suddenly the FDA found that it had the resources and the time to answer these petitions in the negative and say, essentially Johnson's baby powder is fine, even though the FDA had not had a single test result forwarded to it from Johnson & Johnson since 1973. This was in 2014. Suddenly, the FDA rejects petitions filed 20 years and 8 years earlier. Same thing happened with Risperdal. As soon as Johnson & Johnson lost its first pediatric Risperdal case, suddenly the FDA decides to release a statement saying that the warnings on the pediatric use of Risperdal were adequate. Same thing happened in opioids. I mean, remarkably, Johnson & Johnson was by far the largest supplier of opioid ingredients in the United States. It was the drug kingpin when it came to opioids. And the FDA got a lot of criticism of its oversight of opioids. And to deal with that criticism, the agency actually hired a former FDA commissioner, Mark McClellan, who happened to have been serving on the board of directors for Johnson & Johnson for the previous dozen years. So to advise the agency on how to deal with this crisis that was created by Johnson & Johnson, it hired a top Johnson & Johnson person, which is kind of unbelievable. And yet it's that kind of attitude and that kind of reaction that the FDA took again and again and again. And I, tell a specific story about the FDA needing money from the industry in 2012, or would have to lay off hundreds of employees. And the commissioner at the time called up the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, asked for his help. The CEO gave help, rescued these employees, and perhaps, I never saw anything where this was specified as a clear quid pro quo. But in the following months, the FDA decided not to charge any executives in the Risperdal case, not to require that metal-on-metal hip implants be recalled, not to require that vaginal mesh be recalled, all of which would have cost Johnson & Johnson billions of dollars more, and instead took the most lenient stand it could in all of those cases. Was that because Johnson & Johnson had just saved their employees' jobs? I leave that up to the reader to decide.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of, like you said, there are points of time where you have to put the book down and then pick it up later. So some of it is really moving. Um, Talking about style, did the style that you've employed for the book pick itself, or did you have a plan in mind, that, this over that and this works better? How did you zero down on the style? I mean, did you work like an investigative reporter, essentially?
So Ramya, I needed help on that. I have to say, as I said, the book was nearly twice as long, and I ended up hiring an editor to help me, not only on the decisions about which products to include in the end,
Yeah.
but also about the stylistic questions. The original version of the book had more personal stuff from me and my years as a reporter covering the company. It's odd because there were some really important moments in the history of Johnson & Johnson in which I played something of a role as a reporter. That was true in the Risperdal case and some others. But my editors thought at the end that that the reader needed a really neutral voice in telling this story, because you have said the story is so dark and has so many appalling elements that the only way that it can work to be told is to be told in a very low-key, neutral way, because you want, as you know, as a very, I know you're a very good editor, Ramya, and when you have the facts, You just want the facts to tell themselves, and not have any distractions with any personal stuff or any noise otherwise. So that's one of the reasons why it took so long to write, is to get that tone just right. And it was difficult to write without some sense of outrage. Again, we're talking about 2 million deaths. We're talking about a company that is one of the most deadly human organizations in human history. Um, and um, and yet I really had to avoid any kind of um, emotional statements at all. I needed the story to tell itself through the facts and through the documents. As you know, Ramya, the end notes of the book are nearly 100 pages long. I put together my own website that actually I was some friends in India helped me construct, because, as you know, India has extraordinary website creators. And I'm just a writer, so I have to do things on a shoestring. So friends in India helped put it together, and I have thousands of documents on my website so that you, as a reader, can go look at this information yourself and do your own research.
Right. Yeah. Glad to be the tech gurus to play a small role in your book.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, I have a couple of questions. Maybe we've had you for over half an hour, but I have a couple of questions that I'd be glad to hear your opinion on. In your view, in your very considered view, do you think there was a turning point when Johnson and Johnson could have made a difficult decision, go with the consumer rather than the brand, go after health and well-being rather than profit? Do you think that was possible?
I do. And I tell that story. I think it is understandable that Johnson and Johnson didn't do much about baby powder in the 60s and early 70s. It became aware that there was asbestos in baby powder in the 1950s, according to the documents that I have. And through the 1960s, there were some concerns expressed internally about this, including from Johnson and Johnson's great leader, which, Robert Wood Johnson II. But at the time in the 1960s, asbestos was sort of everywhere in American society and around the world. There was not a plane, a boat, a home, a car that didn't have asbestos in it. And it wasn't until a whole series of studies occurred in the 1960s and early 1970s that researchers and then the public began to realize that asbestos was uniquely dangerous amongst the rocks and dust that we routinely use. Because we've all known for a long time that industrial uses of rock can lead to disease, that coal miners get black lung, that silica can lead to silicosis, that even clothing plants with the dust from cotton can lead to a form of lung disease. But those are people who are breathing in huge amounts of dust. And it was thought that these dusts would be fine in small amounts, as you know. But through the 1960s, there were a whole series of studies looking at what were known as domestic exposures of asbestos. And this is women would get asbestosis even though they'd only cleaned their husband's clothes. Children or middle-aged people would get asbestosis and cancer even though they just lived a mile away from an asbestos mine. And so this realization that asbestos not only caused chronic obstructive lung disease when you breathed it in great quantities, but it could cause this cancer of the lining of the lung, even when you just had breathed in microscopic amounts. This is called mesothelioma, as you know, Ramya. So by the late 1960s, it's starting to become clear that even small amounts of asbestos could be dangerous. And of course, this is a product that is being used on babies by mothers. And, you know, half of the use of Johnson's baby powder was by women who used it to kind of cover up normal smells. They would sprinkle it in their underwear, or they would spread it under, you know, put it in their bras because they really liked the smell of it. And so, and then in 1982, a Harvard researcher did the first epidemiological study showing that women who used a lot of talcum-based powders had almost twice the amount of ovarian cancer as women who didn't. And it was the first time that all of this research had sort of come together. The research on small exposures to asbestos on the one hand, and now epidemiology showing that it really had a real impact on women. And that 1982 year is crucial because it's also the year that there was this Tylenol poisoning scare that Johnson & Johnson managed to really hide its way through, and at the end of it was its response to that crisis was seen as a model, even though it it was the real reaction within the company was far from ideal. It's a story I retell, and somehow I think that being able to do something not so good and be admired for it kind of really corrupted the company in a basic way. And instead of doing the right thing on baby powder, and you know, many other large manufacturers of talcum powder got out of the talcum powder business around 1982. Pfizer got out of it. Colgate Palmolive soon got out of it. Johnson and Johnson stuck with it. And there was this, I think there was this kind of arrogance that they saw themselves as so uniquely good that they could kind of get away with anything. And it was that sense of impunity that really started driving the company. And that's when you start seeing all this very bad behavior around EPO, this cancer drug that it knew would kill cancer patients. And yet they continued to sell it, you know, around other products like that heartburn drug Propulsid and its effects on babies, around opioids, selling opioids in a way that it knew would cause an enormous amount of injury and death. And so I really think it was that period in the early 1980s and perhaps the late 1970s. And it was Johnson's baby powder in particular that sort of provided the ladder down which the company itself descended into real darkness.
Right. As you speak, Gardner, I mean, it's true that, one feels a continuous sense of outrage. It's just incomprehensible that so much happened, with one company completely unchecked. And your book also is quite evocative in that sense. I think you've told the truth, the whole truth, very effectively, and thank you for that again. The other question is a sort of uh, you know um, what happens after. So uh, there is trouble writing the story, but as journalists, we wait for the morning when the story is published, or these days when the story hits the website. So what happened after publication? Did Johnson and Johnson come down on you like a ton of bricks? I mean, whatever they did, they couldn't prevent you from getting on the New Yorker's bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list. But what did they try to do? And as a result of your publication, have you seen any meaningful changes in corporate transparency or product safety, either regulations, either at Johnson and Johnson or in general?
So Ramya, I mean, the simple answer is no. I mean, um, the company did provide, I was on CNBC, the financial network, a couple of weeks ago. The company provided a statement to them that basically sort of said, look, we're looking toward the future. And, they're not going to respond to uh, any of the specific allegations in the book. I think one of the my guess is that one of the scary parts of the book for them is that I do quote sworn testimony before grand juries. This testimony is supposed to be secret. I do have those documents. I quote only a small fraction of the amount of information that I have. I think my guess is they know that if they come after me, there could be even worse that would come to light. And I think also that it would give more attention to the book. So I think their hope is, Ramya, that the book just kind of goes away, as you know, most books do, and they'll go back to business as usual. I I have seen some changes at the FDA. The FDA actually remarkably had an expert advisory committee hearing 3 weeks ago about talc, in which the FDA commissioner, in no uncertain terms, said that talcum powder is carcinogenic, and that research has been clear that since the early 1990s that it's carcinogenic. So the FDA commissioner basically said publicly that Johnson and Johnson for nearly 30 years sold a product to the general public, to women and children, that it knew research had shown was carcinogenic. It was an extraordinary statement by the top uh, medical regulator in the United States. And I think it could potentially have a profound effect on Johnson and Johnson's defense of the 93,000 baby powder lawsuits that it's facing. So there are some hints that the book may cause problems for Johnson and Johnson in the future. But these our societies are slow to change, Ramya, as you know. And again, this is a company that is one of the most profitable in the world. It makes billions upon billions of dollars, and that kind of money can buy you out of any kind of serious accountability. And it has for a long time, and I expect that it will for a long time in the future.
Right. That's sobering as it can be. I also wanted to ask you, your barmaid whom you start the story with, did she ever get back to you? Did she say, "Hey, I read your book"? Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But it's interesting to know if she ever got back to you.
It's a fascinating I, again, because of these grand jury files, I got employee rosters and hundreds of employees and their cell phone numbers. And, I went through and tried to find her. I didn't. I have been sort of waiting for the phone to ring since the book came out almost 3 months ago. It hasn't. Um, I'm sure for her, it's as it has been for a lot of Johnson and Johnson employees. I did speak to a lot of them. A lot of them have real ambivalence about their time, and it causes them a lot of psychic difficulty because some of them really believed in the company while they worked there. Some of them, and I described this process for some employees who did speak to me. Some of them realized while working there that there was something deeply wrong with the company. But I think for a lot of people who do participate in the healthcare system, and I think this is true in the United States, and I think it's true in India as well, you make extraordinary compromises that oftentimes are not at all helpful for your patients. I think for most doctors, nurses, and the rest, they hope that those compromises are small and that the effects on their patients are minimal. But when you look at the system writ large and the hundreds of millions of people who participate in the system, those small little compromises will end up leading to some deaths. And I think it's a really difficult thing. And as I said, it's why I go to church. I ended up having a talk with my church about how to cope with this. I think we all, to some extent, participate in somewhat corrupt systems, and we all figure out our own ways of dealing with that. And that woman, I think, has chosen to move on and I think try to put it behind her.
Right. Thank you so much, Gardner. And believe me when I say, I get you, and I get the book, and I hope more people will read it. And there will be, there's always the pot at the end of the rainbow. And I hope for the patients and for people who use Johnson and Johnson products, and or have no knowledge that they're using Johnson and Johnson products in some sense, will get a sense of what this company is about. And thank you so much for speaking to the Hindu. And I wish you luck and a lot of legal help, perhaps, in the future. Thank you so much, Gardiner. Lovely having
Thank you,
you.
Ram.